So today I'm going to be talking about a topic I've wanted to cover at least for a little while now, and that's symmetry versus asymmetry in character design. So starting off, usually symmetry is used because, people are symmetrical, and there's a lot of things that are symmetrical in people and in nature, such as leaves, limbs, parts of the face. But there's a lot of things that end up just naturally occurring symmetry. So the first thing I want to cover as far as symmetry versus asymmetry is the concept of perfect symmetry. So if you've been drawing for a while, or if you're just starting out in drawing, symmetry is something that's pretty difficult to get right. Um, it's an easy concept to get, but it's a lot more difficult in practice to actually do, which is why people practice so much at it. So the first thing I want to cover, at least from a character design perspective, is the idea of perfect symmetry. So what I mean by perfect symmetry and how I was able to get perfect symmetry is if you look at, I just need to, sorry, but if you look at this example on the left, this example on the left was drawn with a mirror tool split down the middle to make it perfectly symmetrical. And it is perfectly symmetrical because, a computer did the other half based on what I drew on one half. And this is technically perfect. And what I mean by technically perfect is I mean on a technical level, if you are going for symmetry, it matches all the criteria. It matches all of it to a T. The only problem is even though it's technically perfect, it shouldn't be. Because it's a human faces automatically have points of asymmetry, or where things are not symmetrical, where things do not match up on one side as they do on the other, because people do not look perfect. If you go and you look at some phases, maybe you look at some phases of celebrities or photos of family members or anything else you might think of, if you look at a person's face, it is not perfectly symmetrical. You'll notice little details that will be slightly off from one another. And on this left example, that's not there, and what it does is it gives a feeling of it looking artificial and like it was done by a machine, because it was. The other half of this face was done by a machine. And although it looks technically perfect, it looks a bit too perfect because it is technically perfect. Because it looks too perfect, it looks artificial. It doesn't really look as human as it should. So for this example on the right, I tried the same thing, but instead of using the mirror tool, I freehanded the other side. And you'll notice there are points where it is not symmetrical on both sides. Let's try and highlight it here, but the points I want to focus on would be the eyes and eyebrows are not perfectly symmetrical. If you were to draw a straight line straight through the eyes, you'll notice that they're kind of off from one another. They're not perfectly on that same line with one another. They're a little bit different sizes. The same with the eyebrows. You can see the eyebrows, they're not perfectly level with each other. The size and shape is a little bit different. You can also notice it with the hair right here, and also with the ears a little bit. And also right here, this was a little bit of making something asymmetrical to make it look more organic. Here you can see the little part of the upper lip where it was intentionally made a little bit asymmetrical. Now, you do want to keep the overall symmetry so that it does look professional, it looks intentional. You want to keep the overall symmetry. So what I mean by that is you want the overall shape of the head, to be symmetrical on both sides, but it's perfectly fine to get littler details like the eyes, and the eyebrows, and maybe the ears and the nostrils, but just make little tweaks. You know, you want to keep that overall shape and you want to keep it symmetrical as a whole, but it's perfectly fine to have small little things that you change up to make it unique. You know, because people aren't perfectly symmetrical, so if you're drawing people, it doesn't have to be perfectly symmetrical. So try and get that overall shape and that overall symmetry, but try and make things a little bit asymmetrical to make it look a bit more natural. So that's, going over some pros and cons of being perfectly symmetrical. And with this, I want, that was some cons of being perfectly symmetrical, having it feel more organic. So now I'm going to be trying to go over a pro of something being perfectly symmetric. So here I have another drawing drawn with a mirror tool, so it's perfectly reflected on both sides. But it works a bit better here because it is supposed to look artificial. This is supposed to look like a helmet that was made in a factory. It was machine pressed, it came off an assembly line. So for it to look a bit more artificial and a bit more man-made, that's something that's perfectly fine in this instance because that's the intention. The artificiality serves a purpose, factory-made, machine-like. This was done with the mirror tool, but there are also some hand-drawn elements to where, even though there's elements that do look artificial and do look a little bit too perfect, there are other things that sort of scuff it up a bit and make it look a bit more natural. For example, even though all the shapes and line art, even though all of that is perfectly symmetrical, the shading that was put in is not perfectly symmetrical. The light source isn't perfectly above the light source is over here off to the side of it. And the shading technique that I used for this helmet is off a little bit. And also there's a little bit of asymmetry in these little tubes that are coming off his mask. And that's also to break up the shape of it a bit and make it look more unique and interesting to look at. So now that I've shown some examples, just some general examples, I'm going to be going into some specific examples by showing specific characters that use asymmetry. So the first character I have here this is something I've drawn earlier, but this is a drawing of a character from the Guilty Gear franchise, a character by the name of Baiken, or Baiken. I'm just going to go with Baiken because that's a bit easier to pronounce. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. But the reason I bring this character up is she has a pretty good example of asymmetry that there's other characters that use it, which is kind of why I wanted to showcase her character. The examples of asymmetry with her character is you got an example here of one arm is missing. And you also have that torn sleeve for the arm that's missing on that side. What you also have here is you have her eye patch from some battle damage she sustained. And those are the two main things. There's a bunch of other littler things like the samurai sword on one side, or the little tassels that are only on one side. And there's a bunch of little things like that, but the overall bigger elements that I want to focus on is this arm and this eye patch. So the reason I bring that up is there's some things I want to bring up with that. So deviations from the norm generate questions. And what I mean by that is, for example, with this character, she's missing an arm. Most people we know are born with two arms, and most people we know, unless you know a bunch of people who are missing arms, you know that. But generally most people I know have both their arms. So if I see a person who's missing an arm, it makes me ask a question. It makes me go, what happened to your arm? Why do you no longer have an arm? How come you're wearing an eye patch now? I've met a person who they're missing part of their finger, and that made me ask the question, how'd that happen? So it generates questions, and that's kind of nice because it takes some of the heavy lifting off of you. You know, because instead of having to rehash other stuff that other people have done, you can go, oh, I'll make them missing a limb, or maybe they got an extra limb. Maybe there's a character where they've got two arms on one side, you know, or maybe one of their arms is bigger than the other, or yada yada yada, any number of things. But it's pretty cool because the design element of her missing an arm and also having that eye patch, it ties into her overall character of being a samurai, of being a warrior. So when you see these signs of battle and you know that she's a warrior samurai, it makes you wonder, what was the battle that was fought here? How'd she get hurt? How'd she get injured? Is that the reason why she fights? Did she get these injuries in a fight? It generates questions. And then moving on from that, is the answer satisfying? If you're gonna have questions, you want a satisfying answer. Let's say we go with the same character, this character here. The answer to this question, which I found it on the wiki for this character, the reason she's missing an arm and the reason she's got an eye patch is because there was an attack on her and her family from a faction that they're called Gears in that in the lore they're called Gears, but some Gears attacked her and attacked her family, and that's the reason why she fights. And that's a pretty satisfying answer for this character, is that she lost those things getting attacked, her family got attacked, and because of that, that's why she fights. That's a pretty satisfying answer. Now, it'd be a lot different, and it might not be as satisfying if the answer was, oh, well, she received those injuries when she was working in a factory doing some 9-to-5 job. It might subvert expectations, but it's definitely not going to be as satisfying to hear that as the answer, is that, oh, she lost it in some mundane things not even related. That doesn't mean you can't make that answer satisfying. If you had a comedy character where it's supposed to be a parody and things are supposed to be over the top, maybe you're making fun or you're poking fun at characters who are hard as nail, badass types by going, oh yeah, he just lost a limb in something stupid, even though they're supposed to be this badass character. So it is something you can still work with and you can still do something with to make it interesting. But yeah, overall you want to have a satisfying answer. So it's something you want to keep in mind, that every little detail you add, every deviation from the norm is another question. If the answers to those questions aren't satisfying, what can happen is your audience will stop asking questions. If they know every answer is unsatisfying, they won't want to question anything anymore. And if they don't want to question, you'll start to lose interest. It'll start to just fade into the mess. And you want your character to stand out. You want it to be interesting. You want your character to be fun to look at. You want it to garner interest. So you want to think about these things. And then going back to that subject of satisfying answers, generating questions, is the answer definitive or is it open-ended? With this character, the answers are pretty definitive. There is a character, it's Nick Fury from the Marvel Cinematic Universe. For a long time, and if you don't know Nick Fury, he has an eye patch. For a long time, the question of why does he have an eye patch, what happened to his eye, what were the events surrounding that, for a long time those questions weren't answered. and it was left open-ended. However, it was still interesting because it allowed the audience to fill in the blanks. It allowed the audience to know this character and be like, wow, this character's really cool. How they got this cool element to them, how they got this eye patch must be really cool as well. And that still can be satisfying to leave it open-ended if there's a purpose to it and if it can work for the character. Maybe the character is mysterious. Maybe you're not supposed to know everything about the character, or they have some secrets that'll be revealed later. To leave it open-ended like that, in that case, it makes sense and it can work for your benefit. And then I'm going back to Nick Fury. Something that they did do is later on they answered the question, but they answered it in a scene where it's just a cat scratched its eye out, and they made a joke of it. And it ended up being less satisfying to receive the answer than it was to try and come up with your own answer or your own theory, because the answer ended up being for a throwaway joke, you know? And it's supposed to be this badass character, and then they ended up getting this injury in a pretty stupid way, and it's not supposed to be like a comedic character or parody. He's supposed to be a pretty straight-laced, straightforward character. But anyway, that's an example of maybe it might be more satisfying to leave it open-ended. Maybe it might be more satisfying to make a definitive answer, you know? But both of those can be satisfying based depending on how you use them. But that's just an example that comes to mind for me. So moving on from that, I have a second little sketch here of another character. This character is, if you don't know him, this is a Spartan. He's a super soldier from the series Halo. He goes by the name of Emile, and he's featured in the campaign Halo Reach in the Halo franchise. So he's got some examples of asymmetry as well. Some of the interesting examples is if you notice the shoulders here, they're different sizes, they're different shapes. If you look at the overall shape of it, this one's a bit smaller. I'm just going to outline the shape here so it's a bit easier to see. But you can see even the overall shapes of it, they're a bit different. But what it does by having these shapes that aren't uniform is it breaks up the silhouette in an interesting way. Because he has this unique armor where it's not asymmetrical, so the rest of Noble Team, the other Halo Spartans he works with, their armor does look pretty uniform. Their armor does look pretty normal and standard. And he's supposed to be sort of like he's supposed to be like the odd one out, you know, and you notice that he's got this little skull that he's etched in. He's got a giant knife. Everyone else has a standard issue knife, whereas his character has his own personal knife that he prefers to use. You might hear some dogs barking in the background. Anyway, he's got his own personal knife that he likes to use, and that's unique to him. And also, something about this knife is it's so large and it's so prominent that it also forms part of that shoulder armor, and it also helps break up that silhouette. So that even that knife, that cool little character detail, also serves a little purpose as far as the character. But I mentioned these examples both with this character Emile and this character from the fighting game Baiken. I mention these things because it's the asymmetry, or it's the deviation from the norm. It's breaking up that symmetrical silhouette. It brings some uniqueness. And then also this little module here that breaks up the silhouette. But it's these little elements that deviate from the norm, that break up the silhouette, that it adds some uniqueness to the character. It makes the character more memorable. With Emile, no one else looks like Emile on Noble Team. You know, no one else has. Well, there are a few characters that have the shoulder armor asymmetrical, but there's a lot of little unique character elements where you look at Emile and you know that's Emile. There's a bunch of unique character elements with Baiken where you look at Baiken and you go, that's Baiken. Her missing an arm, her having that eye patch, skulls on her jacket, all those things contribute to a character that's memorable and that looks unique. And you can use asymmetry to do this. Now, the one thing I will say about asymmetry is because it's it's one of the easier things to do to make your character stand out. Some that I've noticed and some that I've seen is I've seen it where it's been overused. Where it's like, okay, if one instance of asymmetry is going to make my character unique, 20 of them has to make them more unique. You know, if I just keep adding instances of asymmetry, it'll be like compound interest. It'll just make things more and more unique, which isn't true. It's true to a point. However, if the asymmetry, if it's not intentionally trying to generate questions, or there's not some intention to it, if there's not some answer you want the audience to have or not to have, if there's not something intentional to it and it's just, I just want to make my character unique for the sake of being unique, what can happen is, ironically enough, it can have the opposite effect, where your character is so unique that they don't look like anything at all. They're so unique that there's nothing identifiable about them, and they just look like a blur. And no one can tell your character apart because there's nothing to distinguish them, because everything distinguishes them. So, just an example here with Emile, he's got this little buckler, this little arm brace, shotgun shells on to break up symmetry. It's on one side, not the other. Shoulders got asymmetry. This little uplink module's got asymmetry. And there's a bunch of examples of asymmetry here to make it unique. However, there's also examples of symmetry. With his little bandolier of canisters here, it's reflected on the other side. You know, and maybe it's not perfectly asymmetrical, but it's at least symmetrical enough where there's some order to it. The same thing with this little bandolier that he's got on his waist. This little bandolier here. That's roughly symmetrical. It brings some order to it. These little straps bring some order to it as well. The overall shape here of the armor, the overall shape of the torso, the overall shape of this helmet, the overall shape of these forearm pieces. These are all things that bring some order to it. That even though there's things that break up the silhouette and that look disorderly, there's also order among the disorder. So you have these disorderly elements with the asymmetry I mentioned before that mark him as unique, someone who stands out. But you also have these orderly elements that make it seem intentional and that also show the more ordered side of him. The more ordered side of him being the soldier. That even though he's a bit of an outcast, he's still a soldier. He's still very squared away. So he still has elements of order. And the same thing, somewhat similar with this character Baiken. Even though she's got these elements of asymmetry, she's also got elements of symmetry with these little skulls on her jacket. You know, and even though the sleeve on this little, I want to call it, a rope, no, but even though these sleeves, the sleeves here and the sleeves here are asymmetrical, even though those are asymmetrical, the sleeves on this little jacket she's wearing are symmetrical. So even though there's these elements of uniqueness, there's also these elements of familiarity among the uniqueness. so that way it doesn't look disordered, so that way it looks intentional and it's purposeful. So use asymmetry, sounds pretty good, just don't go overboard with it, or else it can have the opposite effect, where instead of looking unique, it sort of blends together and it sort of looks like a hodgepodge, you know. And you know, you want to have a purpose, you want to have an intention with it, and you want that intention to be clearly communicated through your character.